Chapter 13, America Enters the Game, the Post-Revolutionary Pivot, an Economic Dead End. In the fragile, uncertain years immediately following the Revolutionary War, the United States was a nation that had won its political freedom, only to find itself facing total financial ruin. The Treaty of Paris had severed the political chains of the British Empire, but it had also severed the lucrative commercial arteries that kept the colonial economy alive. This dire macroeconomic reality functioned as an empty national vault, leaving the infant republic with worthless continental currency, massive war debts, and absolutely no reliable system of federal taxation. Without a manufacturing base of its own, the survival of the United States depended entirely upon maritime commerce. Prior to the Revolution, American prosperity was deeply tied to the British Caribbean. Mainland colonists had built a thriving, high-margin trade network, shipping vast quantities of lumber, dried cod, and agricultural provisions to the sugar-producing islands of the West Indies. In return, they imported molasses and sugar, fueling an economic boom that enriched the coastal cities of New England. However, the British government viewed the newly independent Americans not as trading partners, but as dangerous foreign competitors who needed to be marginalized. To crush this competition, the British Parliament weaponized the Navigation Acts. This mercantile blockade operated as an ocean barrier, strictly forbidding American merchant vessels from entering the lucrative ports of the British West Indies. British naval squadrons stationed in Nova Scotia were ordered to aggressively enforce these trade restrictions, abruptly choking off the primary source of American mercantile wealth. The young nation was suddenly locked out of the global economy. A sudden trade embargo functioned as a closed economic door, paralyzing the bustling wharves of Massachusetts and driving local merchants toward bankruptcy. Men who had spent their lives building mercantile empires now watched their vessels rot at the docks. If these desperate mariners could not discover a massive, entirely new global revenue stream, the American economy was destined to collapse.
The survival of the United States required an audacious pivot away from the Atlantic and toward the farthest, most dangerous edges of the globe. New England merchants realized that the only path to survival lay in bypassing the traditional trade routes entirely.
They possessed hundreds of heavily armed, deep-water vessels that had been built to serve as privateers during the war against the British. These ships were fast, maneuverable, and crewed by men who were accustomed to extreme danger and high-stakes oceanic combat. The merchants decided to turn these weapons of war into instruments of global commerce. Salem, Massachusetts, a relatively small, rocky port north of Boston, became the epicenter of this radical economic shift. Salem had been a thriving fishing and coastal trading hub since the 17th century. But its harbor was too shallow for the massive freight ships of the future. Instead, its merchants focused on speed, agility, and aggressive exploration. They looked toward the East Indies, a legendary region brimming with exotic commodities that the Western world desperately craved. In the late 18th century, no commodity represented global wealth quite like black pepper. Long before the advent of refrigeration, the dried berries of the Piper nigrum vine were essential preservatives and highly coveted flavor enhancers across early modern Eurasia. Pepper was the ultimate international cash crop, capable of driving massive economic expansion and dictating the geopolitical strategies of the world's greatest empires. It was the absolute perfect commodity for a struggling nation looking to mint its own wealth. Bypassing the European monopoly for centuries, the global supply of black pepper had been ruthlessly controlled by European middlemen. The Portuguese, followed closely by the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, maintained a fierce, monopolistic grip on the spice trade of the East Indies. These massive, state-sponsored corporate entities dictated the supply and artificially inflated the price of spices in European and American markets. An American merchant looking to buy pepper was previously forced to purchase it at a staggering markup in London or Amsterdam. Salem merchants, however, refused to accept this British and Dutch economic stranglehold. They understood that if they could sail past the Cape of Good Hope and bypass the European monopolies entirely, they could corner the global spice market. This was an incredibly dangerous proposition, as it meant sailing into uncharted waters controlled by hostile, heavily armed European navies. Yet the economic void at home left them with no other viable choice. Elias Hasket Darby, a fiercely ambitious Salem merchant, was among the first to test these waters. Following the Revolutionary War, Darby converted his large, swift privateer, the Grand Turk, to commercial use. In 1785, he sent the Grand Turk to the Indian Ocean, utilizing a young, brilliant supercargo named William Vans Jr. to manage the business affairs. A supercargo functioned as a floating accountant, traveling with the ship to negotiate trades, handle complex currency exchanges, and maximize the profit of the voyage. Vans proved to be a master of the eastern markets. By trading directly at the Isle de France and the Cape of Good Hope, he brought home a profit that was 3 times the original capital invested in the voyage. This stunning success proved that independent American vessels could successfully bypass the massive European companies and operate profitably in the Indian Ocean. Darby's success acted as a catalyst, sparking a wave of Salem merchants to outfit their own ships for the distant east. The real prize, however, was not just trading in established colonial ports, but finding the raw source of the spices. In 1788, William Vans partnered with another Salem firm to send the brig Cadet to the west coast of Sumatra. Commanded by an intrepid captain named Jonathan Carnes, the Cadet was the first American vessel to explore the remote Sumatran ports of Bencoolen and Padang. Carnes traded for cassia, camphor, and small amounts of pepper, but he also gathered vital intelligence about the island's interior. Carnes learned that the Dutch maintained only a nominal presence on the island, primarily at a small trading post called Fort Marlborough. The vast majority of the island, particularly the rugged northwestern coast of the Aceh province, was completely outside European control. This treacherous coastline was ruled by fiercely independent Achnese warlords who harvested massive quantities of wild black pepper. If an American ship could reach these warlords directly, the European monopoly would be completely broken. The secret of the Rajah. Returning to Salem, Jonathan Carnes quietly shared his explosive intelligence with his uncle, the wealthy merchant Jonathan Peel. Carnes explained that the wild pepper of Sumatra could be bought directly from the suppliers, completely avoiding the exorbitant fees of the Dutch middlemen. Recognizing the unprecedented opportunity, Peel and his partner Ebenezer Beckford decided to fund a highly classified expedition. They quietly purchased a fast, deep-water schooner named the Rajah and outfitted her for a long, secretive voyage. In November of 1795, the Rajah slipped out of Salem harbor under a veil of total secrecy. Carnes carried a crew of only 10 men, 4 iron cannons for defense, and a cargo hold packed with brandy, gin, iron, tobacco, and dried salmon. When the Rajah cleared the port, her official destination was listed simply as India, and no one in the local mercantile community suspected her true purpose. Carnes was sailing directly toward the dangerous pirate-heavy coast of Sumatra to execute the most lucrative trade deal in early American history. The voyage was a masterpiece of endurance and navigation. Carnes sailed across the Atlantic, around the Cape of Good Hope, and deep into the Indian Ocean without the aid of modern charts. Anchoring off the rugged, uncharted Sumatran shoreline at ports like Al-Nabu and Susu, Carnes found the pepper vines teeming with raw spice. He bypassed the established Dutch outposts entirely, engaging directly with the local Achnese warlords to secure his cargo. Operating without a map, Carnes relied entirely on his wits and his ability to navigate the complex political dynamics of the Sumatran chieftains. He traded his New England provisions and Spanish silver directly for bulk black pepper, negotiating prices on the sandy beaches under the tropical sun. He filled the hold of the Rajah to its absolute limit, taking on thousands of pounds of the precious blackberries. 18 months after his quiet departure, Carnes brought the Rajah back into Salem harbor, her hull bursting with raw, unrefined spice. The cargo of the Rajah fundamentally altered the trajectory of the American economy. By eliminating the European middlemen, Carnes generated a staggering 700% profit on a single voyage. This unprecedented financial windfall proved that an independent American vessel could successfully navigate the most remote corners of the globe and return with unimaginable wealth. Salem had found its financial salvation in the form of a small, wrinkled blackberry. High-stakes corporate espionage. The spectacular success of the Rajah ignited a frenzy of mercantile jealousy along the Salem waterfront. The exact origin of Carnes's wild pepper was a fiercely guarded secret, and both he and Jonathan Peel refused to answer any questions regarding their sudden fortune. As one local historian noted, Peel was as dumb as a Salem harbor clam when pressed for details. When the Rajah was quickly refitted and cleared for a second voyage to the East Indies, rival Salem merchants decided they could not afford to be left behind. In a brazen act of high seas corporate espionage, competing ship owners hurriedly outfitted their own vessels. They ordered their captains to stalk the Rajah across the ocean, intending to follow Carnes directly to his hidden source and corner a piece of the market for themselves. It was a literal race across the globe, with millions of dollars in future profits hanging in the balance. Carnes, however, was a master mariner, operating in his element, and he was not about to surrender his monopoly easily. Sailing deep into the Indian Ocean, Carnes successfully evaded his pursuers in the vast expanse of open water. The rival ships, having lost their quarry, hurried to the known port of Bencoolen to search for the pepper, but they were entirely unsuccessful. Frustrated and empty-handed, the stalking ships were forced to proceed to India to fill their holds with whatever standard cargoes they could find. Meanwhile, Carnes slipped away to his secret Arkanese ports, bartering with the local chieftains completely undisturbed. Carnes completed his second voyage completely unbothered, returning to Salem with another £150,000 of the precious black condiment. Yet, an intelligence advantage of that magnitude could not be contained forever. By the time Carnes departed for his third voyage, the secret of the Sumatran coast had finally leaked to the wider mercantile community. Whether a sailor talked in a tavern or a rival simply deduced the location by asking around the East Indies, the location of the wild pepper was exposed. When the Rajah dropped anchor off the Aceh province for the third time, Carnes found the tropical waters already crowded with the sails of competing Salem ships.
Rival captains were furiously bartering with native chieftains, stowing their own holds with the wild pepper. The monopoly of a single man was over, but the monopoly of a single American city had just begun. This frantic rush to Sumatra kicked off an era when Salem reigned absolutely supreme as the world's undisputed pepper capital. Spatial mapping and the guarded treasure map. Knowing the location of the pepper was one thing, but surviving the journey to acquire it was another matter entirely. The western coast of Sumatra was a nautical graveyard, notoriously plagued by unpredictable winds, violent currents, and hidden hazards.
The tropical waters were choked with deadly, uncharted coral reefs capable of tearing the hull out of a wooden merchant vessel in seconds. To sail blindly into these bays was to court financial ruin and certain death. The ultimate triumph of the Salem pepper trade was not merely a victory of bold sailing, but a masterpiece of spatial mapping. To extract the wealth of Sumatra safely, Salem captains had to chart the unchartable. This rigorous spatial mapping functioned as unlocking a dark room, illuminating the unseen topography of the ocean floor and allowing heavy cargo ships to navigate the lethal maze of coral. It was this proprietary data that would allow Salem to lock out foreign competitors.
The New East India Marine Society of Salem, founded in 1799, became the central hub for this maritime intelligence. Membership in this exclusive club was restricted strictly to Salem captains and supercargoes who had personally navigated a ship past the Cape of Good Hope or Cape Horn. The society required its members to keep meticulous daily journals and detailed sea logs during their voyages. Upon returning to Salem, these logs were deposited in the Society's archives, creating a massive, highly proprietary navigational database. Foremost among these maritime cartographers was Captain Charles Moses Endicott. Beginning his career as a supercargo following the War of 1812, Endicott spent the better part of 2 decades meticulously surveying the treacherous northwest coast of Sumatra. Educated at Phillips Academy, Endicott possessed a keen analytical mind perfectly suited for maritime surveying. He recorded exact depths, noted the locations of hidden shoals, and mapped the precise, narrow approaches to remote pepper ports like Kuala Bati, Maki, and Pulau Kio. Working in tandem with cartographers like Samuel Lambert, a fellow member of the East India Marine Society, Endicott helped produce highly detailed, fiercely accurate maritime charts. In 1827, Lambert published a revised chart of the Sumatran coast that incorporated Endicott's vital corrections. This was followed in 1833 by Endicott's own definitive map and an accompanying manual, sailing directions for the pepper ports on the west coast of Sumatra. This proprietary spatial dataset acted as a guarded treasure map for the exclusive use of Salem mariners. Because they possessed the only accurate spatial data for the region, Salem captains held a massive, insurmountable competitive advantage over the rest of the world. British, French, and Dutch merchantmen routinely avoided the reef-choked Akanese coast, deeming it far too hazardous to risk their heavy, cumbersome East Indiamen. Armed with Endicott's precise navigational dataset, Salem vessels moved freely through the danger zones. They effectively locked out rival nations, bypassing the reefs and maintaining a near monopoly on the Sumatran pepper trade for nearly 50 years. Minting America's first millionaires, the wealth generated by this spatial monopoly was beyond the comprehension of the average American citizen. By cornering the global pepper market, the merchants of Salem transformed their small, hard-scrabble seaport into a global powerhouse of unparalleled opulence. During the first 2 decades of the 19th century, Salem was widely considered the wealthiest city per capita in the United States. The profits derived from the pepper trade trickled down into every layer of the local economy, employing shipwrights, sailmakers, coopers, and clerks. This sudden influx of Asian capital was directly responsible for minting America's first generation of true financial titans. Leading the charge was Elias Hasket Darby, the visionary shipowner who had relentlessly pushed his captains to open new markets in the East. Darby's global trading empire was so vast and so deeply profitable that he accumulated wealth on a scale previously unseen in North America. Upon his death in 1799, he left behind an estate valued at roughly $35 billion in modern currency. Darby was widely celebrated as America's first millionaire, possessing a fortune that towered over the agrarian economy of the early republic. He built magnificent mansions, imported exotic plants from Europe, and lived with the grandeur of an aristocrat. His massive wealth was a direct result of his willingness to embrace extreme risk, utilizing his heavily armed ships to bypass traditional markets and forge new, direct supply chains in the Indian Ocean. Darby's success laid the absolute foundation for Salem's golden age. Darby was not alone in his staggering success. Fierce rivals like the Crown and Shield family built their own massive fleets, sending their sons to command pepper ships and reap the golden harvests of the East Indies. The Crown and Shields became so wealthy from the pepper trade that George Crown and Shield Jr. eventually built the Cleopatra's Barge, the first American ocean-going yacht, purely for his own leisure. This level of extreme discretionary spending was previously unimaginable in the austere, puritanical culture of New England. Young men without massive family fortunes also used the pepper trade to catapult themselves into the ranks of the ultra-wealthy. Nathaniel Silsby took command of Darby's ship Benjamin while still a teenager, generating a 100% profit on an 18-month voyage to the east. He and his brothers made small fortunes through aggressive trading, retiring from the sea as vastly wealthy merchants before the age of 30. The profits from black pepper built the sprawling, magnificent federal-style mansions that still stand as monuments to this era on Chestnut Street in Salem today. There have enumerations, animation, the aggressive deployment of repurposed, heavily armed Revolutionary War privateer vessels capable of completing long-haul, high-risk voyages to the East Indies. The strategic elimination of traditional European middlemen, allowing merchants to acquire raw luxury spices at base agricultural prices and sell them at global market rates. The development of a sophisticated re-export economy where millions of pounds of Asian spices were brought to Salem only to be immediately warehoused and resold to European nations at a massive premium. The accumulation and strict guarding of highly proprietary maritime intelligence, which created an informational monopoly that prevented rival domestic and foreign fleets from safely accessing the most lucrative trading ports. Funding a fragile republic. The economic shockwave of the Salem pepper trade extended far beyond the pockets of the Massachusetts elite. In a very literal sense, the spicy dust of the Sumatran coast provided the financial lifeblood that kept the young United States government functioning. During the early 19th century, the federal government possessed no decentralized mechanism to collect domestic income taxes. The National Treasury relied almost exclusively on customs duties levied on imported maritime cargo. A customs duty functioned as a federal toll, requiring merchants to pay a strict percentage of their cargo's value directly to the government before the goods could be legally sold. When a Salem ship returned from the East Indies, it was required to dock at the Salem Custom House, a prominent federal building situated directly on the wharves. Because the volume of the pepper trade was so astronomically high, the duties collected in Salem represented a massive, absolutely vital windfall for the federal budget. At the absolute height of the trade, the tariffs generated by Salem's global merchants funded up to 5% of the entire national treasury. A single ship returning from Sumatra could pay tens of thousands of dollars in duties in a single afternoon. In an era before a standardized federal banking system or vast internal taxation, the revenue generated by black pepper literally helped pay down the national debt, fund the early military, and build the infrastructure of the young republic. Salem's local wealth was underwriting America's national survival. The mechanics of this wealth generation relied heavily on a robust re-export economy. The United States population was far too small to consume the millions of pounds of black pepper arriving on the Salem wharves every year. Instead, Salem merchants warehoused the spice, paid the federal duties, and immediately reloaded the pepper onto outbound ships bound for Europe. In a profound twist of macroeconomic irony, the American merchants who had been locked out of the global economy by European empires were now selling vital Asian commodities back to those very same empires at a massive markup. This re-export economy transformed Salem into a global toll booth. Ships from Russia, France, and the Mediterranean regularly arrived in Massachusetts, specifically to purchase Sumatran pepper that they could not acquire directly themselves. The Salem Custom House recorded the massive influx and outflow of these goods, tracking a staggering volume of international trade that briefly made the United States one of the premier maritime powers on Earth. The humble pepperberry had single-handedly stabilized the economy of a fragile nation. Blood and black gold on the Sumatran coast. Despite the romantic imagery of tall ships and wealthy merchants, the extraction of this black gold was a deeply dangerous and frequently violent enterprise. The western coast of Sumatra was a volatile, lawless frontier, and the local Assamese warlords were fierce, heavily armed, and highly independent. The pepper trade was never a gentle, formalized exchange between equal corporate partners operating under the rule of law. It was a high-tension, high-stakes negotiation conducted at the edge of a sword, where any mistake could lead to immediate slaughter. To procure a cargo, an American captain was forced to anchor his ship offshore, load a small boat with heavy chests of Spanish silver and opium, and row through the surf to negotiate directly on the beach. This protocol left the heavily laden merchant vessels dangerously exposed, riding at anchor with only a small skeleton crew remaining on board for defense. The Sumatran locals, recognizing the immense value of the cargo and the vulnerability of the ships, frequently launched midnight raids. They sought to capture the vessels, slaughter the crews, and plunder the holds for themselves. A sudden pirate attack functioned as a violent, closed economic door, instantly erasing years of profit and costing the lives of young New England sailors. The Salem captains understood these risks intimately, maintaining strict security protocols, keeping cannons loaded, and limiting the number of locals allowed on deck at any given time. Yet the sheer volume of trade and the lengthy delays required to fill a ship's hold meant that vigilance sometimes slipped. When it did, the results were invariably catastrophic. The most infamous and consequential of these violent encounters occurred in February of 1831. Captain Charles Moses Endicott, the very man who had so meticulously charted the coastal reefs, was anchored off the chiefdom of Quelabatu in his heavily armed ship, the Friendship. While Endicott and a small landing party were ashore weighing pepper and negotiating prices, the first mate left in charge of the ship fatally relaxed the security protocols. A large group of armed Sumatrans, moving in small trading boats, quietly boarded the Friendship under the guise of trading. Once on the deck of the American ship, the Sumatrans drew their concealed daggers and initiated a brutal, overwhelming melee. They swiftly overpowered the crew, murdering the first mate and 2 sailors, and successfully seized control of the vessel. From the beach, Endicott watched in absolute horror as his ship was captured, his men were slaughtered, and his massive cargo was plundered. The cartographer who had conquered the reefs had just lost his ship to the warlords of the coast. Poe Adam and the geopolitics of pepper. Captain Endicott and his shore party survived the massacre only through the rapid, courageous intervention of a friendly local dignitary known as Poe Adam. Poe Adam was an entrepreneurial Sumatran leader who operated outside the political boundaries of the hostile warlords, cultivating strong, lucrative business relationships with the American captains. Recognizing the impending danger and the betrayal of the local chiefs, Poe Adam approached Endicott in a small canoe and desperately warned him of the massacre unfolding on the water. Guided by Poe Adam, Endicott and his surviving men piled into a small rowboat and fled down the coast, narrowly evading pursuing canoes armed with spears. They rowed for miles until they reached the safer port of Maki, where they rallied 3 other American trading vessels that were anchored there. Combining their heavily armed crews, the furious Salem captains launched a coordinated, overwhelming counterattack. They sailed back to Kuala Batu and successfully retook the plundered, blood-stained French ship from the Espionage pirates. The rescue, however, came at a devastating personal cost to the local man who made it possible. For his role in saving the American sailors, Poe Adam faced the immediate, violent wrath of his own people. The hostile warlords of Kuala Batu retaliated by burning Poe Adam's property to the ground, seizing his gold and utterly destroying his commercial business. In a heartbreaking letter to the Salem merchant Joseph Peabody, Poe Adam lamented that his steadfast friendship to the Americans had left him completely destitute and an object of derision among his countrymen. The geopolitical shockwaves of the Friendship Massacre quickly reached the highest levels of the United States government.
When the bloodied ship finally limped back into Salem Harbor, the public outcry was deafening, demanding immediate retribution. The pepper trade had become far too critical to the macroeconomic stability of the Republic to allow such a blatant attack to go unpunished. Persuaded by furious Massachusetts merchants and Senator Daniel Webster, President Andrew Jackson ordered a massive, uncompromising military retaliation. In 1832, the United States Navy dispatched the heavily armed frigate Potomac, under the command of Commodore John Downes, to the shores of Sumatra. Arriving off the coast of Kuala Batu, the American warship deployed hundreds of heavily armed Marines and sailors directly into the jungle.
In a brutal, overwhelming display of force, the American troops stormed the beaches, destroyed 5 local forts, and killed over 150 Sumatran warriors, while the frigate bombarded the village with its heavy 32-pound cannons. This ruthless gunboat diplomacy ensured the American merchantmen would not be harassed again for years, proving that the United States was fully prepared to project lethal military power across the globe to protect its vital economic interests. Conclusion: the cartographers of capitalism. The dazzling, violently lucrative golden age of the Salem pepper trade eventually burned itself out. By the late 1840s, the fragile wild pepper vines of the Sumatran coast were yielding smaller harvests, and the aggressive over-importation of spices had permanently depressed global prices. Furthermore, the fundamental nature of the American macroeconomy was undergoing a massive structural shift. The United States was rapidly developing its own domestic manufacturing infrastructure, relying less on the transshipment of exotic luxury goods and more on the industrial raw materials of coal, cotton, and heavy machinery. The sprawling wharves of Salem, which had once been the center of the global spice trade, gradually grew quiet as the massive clipper ships of the later 19th century bypassed the shallow harbor in favor of Boston and New York. The last Salem ship to trade on the Sumatran coast, the Australia, dropped her anchors in 1860, quietly closing the book on an unparalleled era of maritime supremacy. The Millionaires passed on, and the East India Marine Society transformed its collection of curiosities into a museum preserving the artifacts of a bygone era. Yet, the legacy of that initial desperate post-colonial pivot remains deeply woven into the structural DNA of American capitalism. When the British mercantile blockade threatened to strangle the infant republic, the merchants of Salem did not surrender to the economic void. Instead, they aggressively charted the unknown, bypassing the established, insurmountable global monopolies to corner a wildly lucrative, high-risk market. They recognized long before the modern era that superior spatial data was the ultimate global currency, and that controlling information was the key to controlling wealth. By meticulously mapping the deadly, reef-choked waters of the Espionage coast, these men guarded a treasure map that generated unprecedented, world-altering wealth. They succeeded in minting the very first American millionaires and provided the critical federal tax revenue required to sustain a fragile, debt-ridden new republic through its darkest financial hours.
In charting the treacherous waters of the East Indies, the cartographers of Salem proved beyond all doubt that the United States could violently force open the closed doors of global commerce, compete against the greatest empires on Earth, and ultimately win the game.